from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
No one prepared me for how much of my mental energy would go toward feeding my baby. When to feed, what to feed, how to feed. It can be a lot. Today, we're talking all about it.
The biggest myth I hear about baby-led feeding is, okay, well, are these babies more likely to choke? And let me reassure everyone who's listening, there is no evidence that shows that babies that are fed with finger foods directly are more likely to choke than babies that are fed with purees. But it is still really important to be cognizant of how to present food safely.
Welcome to Healthy Children, the podcast for parents from the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm Dr. Bracho-Sanchez, a pediatrician and a mama figuring it out. This is a judgment-free space where all questions are good questions and the answers will hopefully be even better. Let's get started. Today, we're talking about feeding babies, and to do it, we have with us Dr. Krupa Playforth, a board-certified general pediatrician and mom, who also has a fantastic book called Baby Leads the Way from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Krupa, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Krupa, we're going to talk all about the book, but I want to ask you first, what was the motivation behind it? You had an amazing group of people that came together. Tell us how that happened.
It's all through social media. At the start of the pandemic, I created my social media platform to try to create evidence-based information for parents because I felt like that was missing and really needed at a time when there was so much misinformation out there. And then through that social media platform, I met this amazing team of experts who are also moms and who also recognized that there was something missing in the space. I was pregnant at the time with had my third baby. So this was very salient as we were creating this content. What's amazing about social media, it gets such a bad rap, but what's amazing about social media is it is a way for people to come together. So our team includes a number of experts with different areas of expertise. So we've got a pediatric dietitian, a speech and language pathologist, a pediatric allergist, myself, and somebody who is a chef and a graphic designer. And we all were young moms that felt like there was not enough practical information for parents that combined our expertise in a way that was accessible on the specific topic of how to introduce solids safely to your child.
Yeah, and it almost makes you wonder where else other than social media would such a diverse group of women come together. So amazing. What type of advice can parents expect in this book, Krupa?
Our biggest focus was trying to be practical because there's so much information out there and distilling what is important, what is not, what is misinformation, and then also how to actually apply some of that information to your day-to-day life. That can be really hard for a busy parent who's also overwhelmed. So we really wanted to provide the evidence and review the evidence, but then distill it down in a way that made it easy for parents to understand, interpret, and implement.
Krupa, this concept of baby-led feeding is relatively new. So for people who haven't come across it yet, what is it and how is it different from mashing food and giving your baby a puree, for example?
It's a great question. So baby-led feeding is traditionally defined as offering your baby the same foods that the rest of the family is eating, but with some modifications for their safety. So the foods are not typically purees, and your baby is allowed to feed themselves independently. They control the amount, the variety, and they control all of the consumption, and parents have a little bit more of a step-back approach to the feeding journey.
Let's talk evidence, Krupa. Let's discuss some of the latest guidance in science, which you and your team review in this book for us. Let's start with the basics. When is a baby ready to start solids, and how do parents know that the baby's ready?
There are some signs of readiness that we look for, but the most important thing to know is that the optimal time to start solids for most babies is around 6 months of age when they're showing signs of readiness. So some of the signs that we recommend looking for include 6 months developmental age, plus holding the head upright independently, sitting upright unassisted, and then bringing hands and objects to the mouth, which is a precursor then for self-feeding. So those are the big things to look for. There are obviously exceptions, and if a parent is unsure, they should talk to their pediatrician.
Love it. Now, what are the different methods or ways to introduce solids? And is there any evidence that one method is better than another?
That is the question, right?
Yep.
And honestly, for somebody who wrote a book about baby-led feeding, I think maybe my answer might surprise you. But there isn't evidence that one method of how you prepare the food is superior to another method. What we do have increasing evidence for is that there are reasons to allow your baby to self-feed, which is kind of confusing, I think, for a lot of people, because how can you ask a 6-month-old to self-feed? But they can do it. And you can apply self-feeding to purees, to finger foods, if you're going to jump straight into pure baby-led feeding, or a combination of both. It is important for babies to learn how to eat all those different kinds of foods. We have purees in our diet. Purees are part of normal eating. You know, you think about soups and applesauce and yogurt and things like that. We want babies to learn how to self-feed across the board.
I love that. And I have to tell you, that was sort of what I did as a mom. It sounds like that's also what you did as a mom.
Mm-hmm.
I just sort of said, I want my kiddo to learn how to grab a slice of apple and put it in his mouth. And I also want him to learn how to use a spoon and to tell me when he's done eating. Those were sort of my 3 very simple goals. I want you to learn how to use a spoon. I want you to learn how to grab food. And I want you to learn how to tell me when you're done. How did you approach it as a mom, Krupa?
It's pretty similar, although, so I have 3 kids. And in my early parenting days, when I was, a fresh pediatrician with just a lot of book knowledge, not a lot of practical knowledge, I tried baby-led feeding with my first, and it actually went really badly. She just never took to it. She wasn't gaining weight. And I remember thinking that I was clearly just bad at it. And we ended up having to backtrack a little bit and adjust how we were doing things. And she ended up having purees, which hadn't been my vision going in. Then with my second, I was like, maybe I shouldn't bother with baby-led feeding. Maybe we should just start with purees. But honestly, he wanted to feed himself and he took to baby-led feeding like gangbusters. And it's funny to recognize how different kids are. So now, as a more seasoned parent and pediatrician, with my third child, we just sort of let him lead the way. And that was kind of part of the impetus for the book. I actually used a lot of recipes and things from our content as a guide to help me not just support the way he was going to feed naturally, but also to try to create a situation where I wasn't making multiple different meals, because as a busy parent, that's so hard. So family meals that you can just adapt a little bit here and there so that they're safe for babies based on their developmental age, that's the crux of the book.
And thank you for bringing that up, because I have to tell you, another goal that I had was that I wasn't going to kill myself making 10 million different meals around this house. I just wasn't going to do it. So I was feeding what we were eating and I would mash it sometimes. That was it, Krupa. And I also love this point that you made that every child is so different, so we can learn different techniques and have them ready and at our disposal. And I can't wait to read your book to learn more about each of those things. But at the end of the day, it's really sort of matching what your child is asking for and working, of course, with your pediatrician to meet your goals.
And that's true, not just for feeding, right? That it's true for sleep and it's true for discipline. There's so many right ways to do this and so few wrong ways. And I don't think we talk about that enough in pediatrics.
I love that. I love it. I love it. I love it. Now, is there any evidence for ways to reduce the chances of having a picky eater later on? I'm sure you get that question all the time.
We do, because a lot of the literature or sort of the articles on social media will make claims that are not necessarily based in actual evidence. The biggest claim around baby-led feeding and giving your baby finger foods is, oh, that will make them a less picky eater. Truthfully, I don't know that that really bears out in the data. There are reasons to encourage your child to have a diverse palate and to be exposed to a range of flavors and textures, and we encourage that. And there's lots of different reasons to do that. And eventually, most kids do end up eating probably somewhat similarly to their families, which is part of why having this family approach that you did is the way to do it, right? Because then that makes your own life easier long term. But it's really important to know that there's also developmentally appropriate fear of new foods in the toddler years, which undoes a lot of parents, especially if you did baby-led feeding and finger foods, and then you were like, but I still have a picky eater as a toddler, and did I do it wrong? You didn't. That is actually developmentally appropriate at that age.
It's so funny you say that. I was talking to one of my GI gastrointestinal colleagues once who said that it might even be an evolutionary response. If you think about it, safe foods tend to be breads and pastas and rice, right? In places where there may have been disease, whereas the fruits, the veggies before refrigeration and all these things that we have now that keep our food safe were a little bit more dangerous. So listen, our toddlers are pretty smart.
And it's familiar food too, right? Like they don't want to try new foods. And I think that probably has the same basis, the same foundation, that if you've had something and you know it's safe, then that's the right choice over something that's potentially new. With that said, if this were entirely the explanation, I don't know why my toddler puts random things in his mouth, because like, why?
Such a good point, Krupa. Such a good point. They keep us on our toes. Now, we recently aired an episode on food allergies, but it really is worth repeating. Talk to us about the introduction of potentially allergenic foods. What should parents know about this?
Yeah, so we have a lot of recent evidence that the optimal time to introduce allergens for an average risk, otherwise healthy baby is around 6 months for most infants. And that doing it that way, being cognizant of not only introducing each allergen, but then continuing to reintroduce those frequently over the course of a week, that decreases the risk for food allergies down the line. It doesn't completely eliminate it. And so for any parent that listens to that and has a child with a food allergy, it's not because you did something wrong. Allergies are multifactorial. There's lots of different reasons that you develop them, but the research on introducing allergens early and often is super compelling and super interesting. So the book talks about how to introduce the top 9 allergens and also how to watch for red flags and how to make sure that they're introduced safely, because things like peanut butter, for example, are a choking hazard.
Right, right. We have to be careful at the same time that we're following the latest evidence. And I do hope parents will read the whole book, definitely that section of the book, and listen to the podcast episode that we have on that. Now, I also want to ask you, Krupa, about some common things that I hear in my practice. I'm sure you do as well. Parents genuinely worry about not knowing whether their baby is eating enough. What do you say to that?
It's true that there is a learning curve to introducing solids. The reassuring thing that I like to remind parents of in my practice is that in that first year of life, in that 6 to 12 month phase where you're introducing these, what we call complementary foods, the bulk of their actual nutritional intake, the caloric volume and the types of nutrition that they're getting still comes from the milk they're drinking. Whether that's breast milk or formula, it's still going to be the most comprehensive source of nutrition for them. So that gives you a little bit of wiggle room. It doesn't mean solids before 1 are just for fun, as was told to so many of us in training. That's not the case. There are lots of reasons to introduce solids and to have those be a complement to the milk. But if you're worried about your baby's nutrition, it should reassure you to know that they are still getting the bulk of the nutrition that they need if they're drinking milk. If you look at the research on finger foods and baby-led feeding versus purees, one thing that's really interesting is in that 6 to 9 month age range, babies that are fed directly finger foods early, that skip the puree feeding stage, tend to actually take in a little bit less volume. And then between 9 and 12 months, the volume of intake becomes more comparable, but there's no differences in growth or other clinically significant findings in the long term. So it's not something that I worry too much about. Now, if your child has a history of failure to thrive, they're not gaining weight well, they're premature, if they have something else going on, obviously then it becomes a little bit more of a nuanced conversation to have with your pediatrician.
Yeah, I love that. I love that explanation because it makes intuitive sense too, right, Krupa? Like it's in the beginning, maybe they'll take a little bit less volume. Over time, they'll catch up and it has no difference to their growth. So that's, very, very reassuring. And of course, we as pediatricians are always here to help and track how your baby's growing so that we can worry together if worrying is in fact what's warranted.
I like that. That's a good phrase.
We've talked about how to introduce foods, but a lot of parents also ask us about what to actually feed their babies. So if the goal is to optimize nutrition, give us some tips. How do we do this?
So in the book, we talk a lot about the most important things that you want to be thinking about as you're introducing solids. It's really important that babies have diets that are high in fat, high in iron, and are varied in terms of flavors and textures. So if you are using that as your guideline, trying to make sure that every meal that they're having has something that's high in fat and something that's high in iron. And then we also talk about adding something that's high in vitamin C to enhance any iron absorption from the food that's iron rich that they're having. If you are doing that, and then you're just exposing them to this range of textures and flavors, you are doing it right. The additional piece that we talk about is cultivating intuitive eating skills and focusing on oromotor exposure so that they can work on those oromotor skills. But those are the important considerations. Nutrition is something to think about, but again, knowing that you have the safety net of the milk should be helpful.
I love that as guidelines, Krupa, and I think, a lot of parents will find that really helpful. Now, the other thing that worries people, and understandably so, is the risk of choking, which you mentioned briefly. How do we reduce that risk?
The best way to reduce that risk is to serve food by taking note of where each baby is developmentally and then modifying that food for safety. So for example, for a 6-month-old, if you're going to do finger foods, we recommend serving them in sticks, which are easy for them to grasp with that palmar grasp that they have. And then 6-month-olds also have a vertical munching pattern. So if you have food that is soft, we describe it as passing the squish test. But if you have food that's soft and is stick-shaped, it allows them to actually consume it safely. For a 9-month-old who has maybe developed more oromotor skills, we recommend feeding foods in little pieces. They still need to be soft and squishable, but if you present foods in, for example, soft cubes, shreds, pieces, that allows them to practice picking things up with that pincer grasp, which is developmentally where they are at 9 months. And then they have more lateral, sort of side-to-side tongue movements. So then they're learning to manipulate little pieces of food side to side, which again is an important skill that we want them to practice. I do recommend, regardless of whether you do purees, whether you do baby-led feeding, that every parent has CPR training. And then the biggest myth I hear about baby-led feeding is, okay, well, are these babies more likely to choke? And let me reassure everyone who's listening, there is no evidence that shows that babies that are fed with finger foods directly are more likely to choke than babies that are fed with purees. But it is still really important to be cognizant of how to present food safely.
Yeah, so helpful. And last but not least, Krupa, we like to end our show with what we call a parenting prescription. So when it comes to feeding babies, what is one thing you want every parent out there to know?
I think it's really important to trust your gut for most parenting things, but especially in feeding your baby, and to shut out the noise. There's so much information, and a lot of people get some information from extended family and friends and neighbors and the people that are working at the daycare. Everybody has advice, and you've got to stop and think, what is the right path for my baby? And then you shut out the noise. As long as you have some resources that are reliable, safe, evidence-based, you don't need to incorporate every piece of advice from every single person that's giving it to you.
And that applies to so many aspects of parenting. Thank you so much, Dr. Krupa Playforth, author of Baby Leads the Way, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you at home for joining us as well. If you like the Healthy Children podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow Healthy Children on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Healthy Children AAP, and be sure to visit healthychildren.org, the parenting website of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Healthy Children is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our creative team includes
Laura Alessio,
Catherine Beard,
Garrett Brown,
Zach Christman,
Ann Johnsos, Kathy Jewell,
Claire Keating,
Doug Nagel,
Jackie Ortega,
Susan Stevens Martin,
Mary Claire Walsh,
Hannah Weston.
And our theme music was composed by Doug Nagel. We'll be back next week. I'm Dr. Edith Bracho-Sanchez. Thanks for listening.